So let's start with the first topic, which is historical underpinnings. This topic, we are going to talk about the different acts and regulations that were done by EIC and the Crown, um, which affected how our constitution was made, everything that led to the constitution that we have right now. So this is an index that would help you remember everything in one shot, basically. So we can divide the entire rule by the British into two phases. One is the company rule, and the other one is crown rule. The company rule basically started when EIC started getting involved in the polity of India instead of just becoming, just being a commercial entity. So that is when the first act came, which was the Regulating Act 1773, and hence began the political journey of the EIC in India. So, how you can remember the entire phase of company rule is with a simple mnemonic that is regulate करो, amend करो, पिट आया, बोला act करो, तब चार charter act आए. So they regulated, they amended, and PID came and said we'll have to do something about it, we'll have to act, right? That's four. And then there are four charter acts. And how you can remember the years is that, let's see, Regulating Act started 1773. So this is easy, right? 1773, you can remember. Then just add 20, you go to the first Charter Act, right? Then you keep adding 20 and then you get the dates for all of the charter acts. Then we are just left to remember for amending act, Pitt's India Act, and Act of 1786, which is also simple. If you remember 1781, you add 3 here and you add 2 here. So 81, 84, and 86, right? So that's how you can remember the entire chronology of the company rule. Now, coming to the crown rule, we have Government of India Act, then three council Indian Council Acts, and then we have two Government of India Acts again, and then we have Indian Independence Act, right? How you can remember this is GIII, right? And the first date, definitely very easy to remember because I think most people would remember that the first War of Independence happened in 1857, right? And that is after that there was a change, and the the crown was definitely more active, and that's when they started taking over the Indian politics, and EIC was removed, which is the East India Company, right? So it all started with the Regulating Act. So in 1765, the EIC got Diwani rights, and that is when they started interfering the political functions of India. And so 1773 Regulating Act was basically a recognition from the British government of the political functions of EIC in India, right? So it was the first time they recognized the political functions of EIC in India, which is, of course, the East India Company. So, as the features of this act, the governor of Bengal became the Governor General of Bengal, right? And he was made the superior, and the Madras and Bombay presidencies were made the subordinate presidencies. The first Governor General of Bengal was Lord Warren Hastings. The other provision provided by the Regulating Act was the Supreme Court of Calcutta was found, right? And it was found in 1774 when it was provided in the 1773 Regulating Act. In the Supreme Court, there was one Chief Justice and three judges, and the Supreme Court had original jurisdiction as well as appellate jurisdiction, right? So that is about the Regulating Act of 1773. Coming to the amending act, so basically there were certain issues with the regulating act. Those were realized after some time of this act being in the scene. So this act was also called the Settlement Act or the Regulatory Act. It fixed certain issues with the regulating act, removed from Supreme Court jurisdiction. So basically, one of the main things that this amending act did is it removed certain people from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and those were servants of EIC, revenue collection matters, and the Governor General. So basically, the servants of EIC, when they're performing their duties, uh, right, they are exempt from the Supreme Court jurisdiction. When they're collecting the revenues, anything that is related to the revenue matters is exempt from the Supreme Court jurisdiction, and the Governor General is exempt from the Supreme Court jurisdiction. Then appeals from the provincial courts. So this is the N here. The appeals from the provincial courts would not go to the SC anymore. So it will not go to the Supreme Court. It would rather go to the Governor General in Council. So those were some of the amendments made in 1781. Then we have the Pitt India Act of 1784. In this act, basically, something big happened where the British, for the first time, called the territories that were occupied by British as the British possessions in India. That is the first time that any document ever said this phrase, which is British possessions in India, right? Um, and the other thing that it did is it started a dual government, wherein there is COD, which is code of directors, and BOC, which is board of control. So code of directors were the original EIC people who used to handle the commercial functions, and on top of that, a board of control was appointed, which was supposed to handle the political functions. So now um, there was a recognition of the two different kinds of functions, and it was made separate so that basically the British government had more control over the political functions of EIC. Then we have the Act of 1786. So the 1786 Act was came into the picture because the then Governor General of Bengal, who was Lord Cornwallis, he made two demands, right? So these two demands were that he wanted the power to override the decision of his council. So there was a council that was appointed for the governor generals, and they were supposed to act according to their council's decisions, and right. But he wanted the power to override the council decisions. So that power was provided to him by this act, and then he wanted to be called the commander in chief. So that was another thing that happened in this act, right? So now we have the four charter acts. One thing we should know is that as part of the company rule, the whole idea was to go towards the centralization of India, right? And that's what was started by the Regulating Act of 1773, right? So coming to the first Charter Act of 1793, so we know about the overriding power that was given to Cornwallis in the last act that we read about, right? So the Act of 1786, right? So the same power was now extended to all of the future governor generals of Bengal, right? Then the monopoly of East India Company was increased by 20 more years, right? Then the commander-in-chief was not to be a member of the council, right? Unless they were appointed as such. So that was something. So basically, the overriding power was extended, but the commander-in-chief, there was a difference there, right? So that was not extended. They were not to be the member of the council unless appointed. So, and the other thing that came in this act was the board of control members were to be paid from the Indian revenue. So this is when they started, uh, you know, um, taking the money earned from the Indian revenue and then giving it to the board of control, which was the representatives of British government in India, and they were basically um, regulating and they were handling the political functions of the East India Company, right? Coming to the Charter Act of 1813, uh, so the trade monopoly of the company was now abolished. Okay, so we can see in the 1793 Act, they were extended the monopoly for another 20 years. But in this act, the trade monopoly was ended, and the only places they still had monopoly was in the trade with China and the tea trade. So these are the two things where the Brits still had monopoly. Sorry, the East India Company still had monopoly. And in the other areas of business, all of the British merchants were allowed, right? Then Christian missionaries were also allowed. They could do the teachings of the religion, right? Um, then Western education was now a big thing. So basically, 1 lakh of money, of worth of money was allocated for Western education in India. Um, then they authorized local government to impose taxes, and if Indians were not paying the taxes, there was punishment also that was allowed yeah, for not paying the revenue, right? So those were some of the features of the Act of 1813. Then coming to the Charter Act of 1833. So this was the final nail in the coffin. So this was the final step towards the centralization of India, which was started from the Regulating Act. And as part of this act, the features were that the Governor General of Bengal was now made the Governor General of India. So, as you can see, the unification is happening, right? And the first Governor General of India was Lord William Bentinck. So, um, so one detail that we should remember is that all of the acts that happened before the 1833 were called as regulations. And everything that happened after 1833 Charter Act was called acts. So that's a detail. Then EIC's commercial functions were completely ended. So no commercial functions for EIC. Now it's a completely political body, purely administrative. And it was said that EIC is now doing the administrative functions in India in trust for His Majesty, his heirs, and successors. Then this act tried an open competition, but it was opposed by the EIC members, and hence they could not go through with it. And open competition was for basically the civil services, right? So this was where it was first brought up, but it did not um, follow through. Then coming to the Charter Act of 1853. So here we see for the first time the separation of power. We see legislative and executive functions recognized as different functions of a government. And that's the first time done, Charter Act of 1853. So, hence, as part of this, the Indian Legislative Council was formed. It was also called the Central Legislative Council or the Governor General's Legislative Council, right? It acted like a mini parliament, and then the civil servants were now selected from a open competition. So as you can see, in 1833 it was proposed, but it did not follow through. But it in 53 it started, and now there was to be an open competition for selection of the civil servants, and hence the Macaulay Committee was formed. So there was no extension period now for the company's rule. So as you can see in the previous acts, there was always a plus 20-year increment, right? So in the 1793 Act, there was 20-year increment to the monopoly. In 1813, the monopoly was abolished, but still there was a 20-year increment to the rule of the company. And same goes in the 1833 Act, hence the 20-year gap between each of the acts, right? Here, then here, then here. But in this case, there was no increment as such. So what this means is at any time, the company rule can be ended by the British government, right? In the Indian Legislative Council, the members were hired. So basically, there were six members, and four of them were hired by the provincial governments like of Bengal, Madras, Bombay, and Agra. Right. So these provincial governments were hiring the representatives in the Indian Legislative Council. Now let's talk about the Government of India Act of 1858, which was the beginning of the Crown Rule. So, first thing it did was it ended the rule of East India Company. So, as we had talked about in the previous one, right, the Fourth Charter Act, we talked about that it was not extended. The rule of EIC was not extended for any amount of time, which made sure that any time the British government wants, they can take over and abolish the rule of EIC, and which is what happened in 1858 after the Sepoy Mutiny, the first War of Independence, also this is called, which was in 1857. The British government took action and removed EIC. This act was also called the Act for the Good Government of India. And basically, this was the first step towards the decentralization of power. So basically, the all of the acts and everything that happened before the Crown Rule were the ones that basically worked towards the centralization of power in India. And now we are talking about the decentralization. So first thing that happened was that the Governor General of India was now called the Viceroy of India, and the first Viceroy of India was Lord Canning, right? The dual government was ended, which is the Board of Control and Court of Directors. So this was ended, and now we had a new office of Secretary of State, which is a person from the British cabinet was now going to handle the complete administration of India. And one fact is that they could be sued also, and they could be sued in India and they could also be sued in England. This could be basically some sort of pre-question, if you will. Another thing is that the Secretary of State was given a 15-member advisory council, and that advisory council was to assist the Secretary of State. And later, the Government of India Act of 1835 abolished the Secretary of State office, right? So That's the thing. Then the basically this act was publicized as it was an improvement of the administrative machinery in India. Right. So now let's talk about the Indian Councils Act. Um And before we delve into all of the different acts that happened, let's see why the Indian Council Acts were called as such. So, usually, when we look at the features of the Indian Council Acts, we find out that they were mainly focused on expanding or reforming the legislative council. So, usually, and it's also a good way to remember the features of these acts because they will usually revolve around expanding the number of members, whether it would be your central legislative council or provincial legislative council, and reforming it, like basically trying to include Indian members in there, and as such, right? So moving on to the 1861 Indian Councils Act. The first feature was that the Viceroy of India was to nominate Indian non-official members. So basically, now they were allowed to be non-official members who could be of Indian origin. Uh, they're still not allowed, like the official members are still not allowed to be Indians, but they could have non-official members of the council who could be Indians, right? The other thing is that as part of this, then Lord Canning, who was the first Viceroy of India, nominated Raja of Banaras, Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. So this is a good thing to remember for pre, basically. That who were the three people nominated by Canning for the Indian members of the Legislative Council, right? Then this marked the start of the decentralization, as we talked about. So basically, everything that happened after the end of EIC rule was a step towards the decentralization of Indian power and going towards the federal aspect of it, right? So it's restored the legislative powers of Bengal and Madras. So we've seen earlier that the power of Bengal and Madras was dissolved when it was at the peak of centralization at the end of the EIC rule, right? And now these powers were restored uh, by the Indian Councils Act of 1861. And then this act also provided for the Legislative Council of Bengal, Punjab, Northwestern provinces, right? So these were new legislative councils that were provided for the provinces. Then Viceroy of India was allowed to have ordinances during emergency. So we can correlate this to now the governor or the president having ordinances during an emergency. So this was something similar. The first time this came up was in the Indian Councils Acts of 1861. Then there was a portfolio system. So basically, under the portfolio system, a member of Viceroy's Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government and was authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the council on matters of his department. So basically, every person was allotted some departments and they would be handling those. So, like this person handles one department and they're like made in charge of certain departments. So these are departments, right? That's the portfolio system for you. Moving on to the Indian Councils Act of 1892. Um, Again, so it was an extension of, giving more power to the Legislative Council. So how it was done is they were now allowed to discuss budget and they could answer questions to the executives. So those were the new things that were now given to the Legislative Council. The non-official members were now increased. So at the center, there could be now 16 non-official members. And as we've seen earlier, those could be like Indian members, right? So, and the other thing is nominations of the non-official members. In the center, these nominations were done by the viceroy, right? And the viceroy was recommended by the provincial legislative councils and Bengal Chamber of Commerce. So that is how the viceroy came up with the nominations. And in the provincial legislative councils, the governor was doing the nominations and they were recommended by the different authorities of the district, right? Those could be like zamindars and all the important dignitaries, right? Then limited and indirect elections were seen for the first time. So to nominate the non-official members. Coming to the Indian Councils Act of 1909, this act was also called Morley-Minto reforms because at that time Lord Morley was the Secretary of State and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India. And usually that is how they also named another act also. So they used the Secretary's name first and then Viceroy's name second, right? Then there is the Central Legislative Council. The members were increased. The non-official members were increased from 16 to 60. As you can see here, we had 16. Now it was increased to 60. And the official majority was still retained by the British, right? But the non-official members were allowed to take majority in total, but not officially. In the provincial legislative council, the non-official majority was allowed, and now Indians were also allowed in the executive council of the Viceroy of India. So far we've been talking about the legislative council. But for the first time now, in the Executive Council also, Indians were allowed. And the first such member from India who was appointed in the Executive Council of the Viceroy was Satyendra Prasad Sinha, and he was appointed as a law member in the Executive Council. Then there was separate electorate, which is a very important point. There was communalism and communal electorate that was introduced by Lord Minto. And this was first done in the Indian Councils Act 1909, and it was just for Muslims in the beginning, right? We'll talk more about this and how different other communities were added. But for the first time in 1909, the communal electorate was only for Muslims. That's something we should remember. Separate representation for presidency corporations. So yeah, that was there. What communal electorate means is that for one community, only the members of that particular committee would be allowed to elect them. So let's say in this case for Muslims, only Muslims are allowed to elect and vote, although vote was not a word that was used till then, but it's similar thing. Only Muslims were allowed to elect Muslims. That is what the communal electorate means. Let's talk about the Government of India Act 1919. It was also called the Montague-Chelmsford reforms because Montague was the Secretary of State at the time and Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India at the time. So it introduced the devolution of power, wherein some of the subjects were divided among the state, the center, and the provinces. Um, the center was allowed to make legislations on the certain list of subjects, and the provinces were allowed to make legislations on another list of subjects. So that was devolution of power. And inside the devolution of power, there was hierarchy, which was provided in the provincial subjects, wherein there were two kinds of subjects, transferred and reserved. And it divided the responsibility between the elected Indian ministers and appointed British officials. So basically, the transferred subjects were the subjects on which the governor was to make legislations with the advice of the legislative council. And then there were reserved subjects where the governor was to make legislations on the advice of the executive council and not the legislative council. And the legislative council, as we all know, has the Indian ministers, but the executive council does not. And so the reserved subjects were such subjects on which the British officials solely made the legislations, and Indian officials were not allowed to make legislations on those. So that is diarchy. Now there was bicameralism that was introduced. So in the Indian Legislative Council, upper which means we had the upper house and the lower house, which was, if you draw parallel between that and now, it is similar to what we have now. We have the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha. Uh, it was similar, right? Then, for the first time, direct elections were introduced, but there was limited franchise, which means limited people were allowed to vote. But it was still, for the first time, elections were seen, and that was in 1919 Government of India Act that you should remember. Then three out of the six members of the Viceroy's Executive Council could be Indians now. So, as we've seen in the previous act, the first person, the law member who was allowed to be a part of the Executive Council, now three out of six members were to be Indian in the Viceroy's Executive Council. Then, communal electorate was introduced. Communal electorate was introduced in the act before this itself, which is the um, uh, Indian Councils Act that happened, wherein Muslims were given a separate electorate. But as part of the 1919 Government of India Act, the same rule was now extended for different other communities as well, which was Sikh community, Indian Christians, and Anglo-Indians and Europeans. So these four communities were also extended the communal electorate in 1919. The Office of High Commissioner of India in London was now formed, right? So some of the functions of the Secretary of States were given to the High Commissioner of India in London. Then Public Service Commission was established. The Central Public Service Commission was established in 1926. So this act of 1919 provided for a Public Service Commission to be formed, and as a result of that, in 1926, Central Public Service Commission was formed. Then there was separate provincial and state budget for the first time. The budget was divided, and the provinces were allowed to act on them as well, right? Provincial legislature was allowed to act on the budget. Then there is statutory commission, um, which was formed, and it was to inquire and report on the Government of India Act 1919. So this act provided for a statutory council, which was to review all of the changes that happened after the act, and they were to report on them uh, after 10 years of it being in picture. But I mean, we'll see later, just a little later. The Simon Commission was formed as part of this, and it was formed in 1927, which was a little early. It was supposed to be formed in 1929, which is 10 years later, but it was formed earlier in 1927 to report on the workings of the Government of India Act 1990. Then we have another institution that was formed, which was the Narendra Mandal, and it was also called the Chamber of Princes, and it was inaugurated in 1921, right? So now let's talk about the Simon Commission. This was a seven-member body headed by Sir John Simon, which is why it is called the Simon Commission. And all of the seven members were British, which was a huge point of aggression among the Indian party members, and they boycotted this entirely because of the same reason. It was a statutory commission formed by the 1919 Government of India Act, and the report that it gave the report in 1930. It came up with the following suggestions here, right? So the first suggestion was the abolition of diarchy. The other one was that provinces should be given more autonomy, and the responsible self-government should be promoted. And then continuation of communal electorate, discretionary power to the governor, federal structure, and it came up with the white pages on the constitutional reforms, right? And according to these white papers, the Government of India Act 1935 was enacted. So in 1932, Ramsay MacDonald, British PM, introduced something called the Communal Award. So, Communal Award was similar to the communal electorate, and it was extended to the scheduled caste section of the society, which made Mahatma Gandhi agitated. So basically, Mahatma Gandhi went in onto a fast on to death in Yaravada jail in Pune. And basically, he was not happy with having a separate electorate for scheduled caste because he believed that that separated them from the Hindu community, and which was not the case. So then, after some to and fro, there was discussion, and the Pune Pact was finalized. Uh, The Pune Pact happened between B.R. Ambedkar and Congress, and it says that instead of having communal electorate for scheduled caste, there would be a reservation for SCs in the general electorate only. So within the Hindu joint electorate, there would be reservations for scheduled caste community as well. That was finalized as part of the Pune Pact. So now coming to the Government of India Act 1935. So in this act, we are going to see that the Simon Commission's recommendations are going to be followed. So the white paper that the Simon Commission came up with, the report that it came up with was called the white paper. That is what was followed in the 1935 Government of India Act. Um, so let's see. The first thing that it did was it defined a federal structure, and there were now three lists: the federal list, the provincial list, and the concurrent list. It is similar to the seventh schedule that we have now. We have three lists, and the state and the unions, and there's concurrent, and their separation, the devolution of power, and the states are allowed to legislate on the state list subjects, and the union is allowed to legislate on the union list subjects. Then there was abolition of diarchy in the provinces, so now there is no more transferred and reserved subjects, and the provincial autonomy and self-government was promoted. Bicameralism in provinces. Now, provinces were also going to have upper and lower houses, not just the center. And the diarchy in center was also introduced. But this rule never came into existence at the time. This was opposed, and it never came in operation. Then reservations for SCs. So as we've seen in the Pune Pact, it was decided that SCs are going to be given reservations in the Hindu electorate only. The same was done, and also the reservation was now extended to women and laborers as well in the general electorate itself. Then we have the franchise. So, as we've seen in the Act of 1919, limited franchise was introduced, and this act extended it. It increased the franchise to 14%. Now, 14% people are now going to vote, right? Then we have Odisha and Sindh. It's just a fact that Odisha and Sindh were created and provided for as part of the Act of 1935. Then Burma was separated from India, now Myanmar, um, as part of the 1935 Act. The 1935 Act also provided for the Reserve Bank of India, the Auditor General of India, the Federal Railway Authority, the Federal Court, and the um, Public Service Commission. We've seen in the previous act, the Central Public Service Commission was formed. In this act, Public Service Commission, Provincial Public Service Commission, and Joint Public Service Commission was formed. So, Joint Public Service Commission means when two or more provinces want to have one public service commission, that's the Joint Public Service Commission. Now let's talk about the Independence Act of 1947. So after the Act of 1935, um, the British PM one day declared that India is going to get its independence, and that is when um, the Act of 1947 was enacted, and we'll talk more about it, how that happened, or what were the steps that led to this, and what happened after this, right? But let's talk about the features of the Indian Independence Act of 1947. So the first thing that we can also quote in a mains answer is that it marked the lapse of the British paramountcy, which means that now freedom of princely states to choose India and Pakistan, that was there, and removed the Emperor of India from British monarch's title. Now the British monarch is no longer the Emperor of India. That's what it stated. Then it also provided for the separation of India and Pakistan. It abolished the office of Viceroy. It abolished the office of Secretary of State. And instead of Viceroy, now we have nominal head. And the nominal head was to act on the advice of the councils, right? And then instead of Secretary of State, the functions were now transferred to the Secretary of Commonwealth Affairs. Yeah. And as part of this act, it was stated that now India was allowed to adopt any constitution that it liked. It could repeal any of the acts of the British Parliament, including the Independence Act itself. Then it could continue the governance by the Government of India Act of 1935 by making amendments or changes as needed till the new constitution was formed. So that is the provision of the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Now, your job is to find the answer of these three questions. And ideally, if you listen carefully, you should be able to get the answers from what we have discussed so far. The first question is the distribution of power between the center and the states in the Indian Constitution is based on the scheme provided in which of the following acts? So, yeah. And the other question is the East India Company got Diwani rights in 1765. What does Diwani right mean? Right. And the other question is that which of the following is not a feature of the Regulating Act 1773? So, if you know the features of the Regulating Act 1773, which was the first act enacted that recognized the political functions of EIC in India by the British government, then you would be able to answer this. Thank you.